Hey guys, so today I'll be making a video for all of us. Nico posted a hand on Thursday evening, I think. Today is Sunday in the middle of the afternoon. Um, and so thanks for posting the hand. It's good that we finally got one here. But firstly, uh, when you do post a hand, please explain the entire thought process. Over here, you kind of just, like posted the hand, and then you didn't really explain your thought process. You just like, should I, is the shove on the turn good? Maybe I should raise non-all in. I guess just call is good. But you didn't explain why you shoved. You didn't explain why you're considering raise. You're not explaining why you consider calling very good. So, there has to be a reason behind all the actions when going through the hands, and that can help everyone else in the group to know what your thought process is. And then together we can discuss what we may agree or disagree on, what might have to change through these thought processes. Um, so yeah, I like that we have a hand posted, but the manner in which it was posted could be better. Like, try to not only ask questions, but also explain what's going on through your mind. And you could explain what's going on through your mind through every step of the hand. For example, I don't know, for me at least, this isn't a very standard check back on the flop. But we're going to talk about this. The second thing I wanted to talk about before I get into the review is like, yeah, so it's been like over 2 days now and nobody replied, so I felt like I kind of had to make a video because I didn't want like the hand to just go into oblivion and just nobody talk about it. But I don't know why nobody else posted their thoughts. It's been over 2 days now and nobody wrote a single thing. It would be nice if you guys could be a bit more active. You don't even need to know the answer. You could just share your thoughts. You don't need to like know for sure that you're right or wrong. Just share your thoughts. Try to keep the group active. So that was a bit disappointing, but at least I'm gonna try to answer right now. So, anyways, I said that I'll make a video, and then I said I wanted a few more explanations behind the thought process during the entire hand, like why check the flop, why jam the turn, which are two of the main points I was curious about. And he said that he checked the flop because he's used to checking back his second pair with a queen kicker or worse to protect his checking range. But now I guess I should have bet my range looking at the range advantage, I guess. I mean, that's only one factor. We'll get into all the factors later. This is actually kind of a minor factor, to be honest. But yeah, it's definitely there. And on the turn, you suppose he's gonna call all his top pair Jack X of hearts and don't want the river to block the action and put you in a weird spot. So I definitely kind of understand, but yeah, we're gonna talk about that too. Struggling since a long time with fear of the next street. Yeah, I think a lot of people struggle with that. So, uh, and basically going through a lot of these spots and understanding why you don't need to fear things is going to help you to get rid of that fear, basically. So I think it's important that you go through these spots yourself a lot. I mean, I can't do everything, obviously. Good rag would fold King X, yeah, for sure. Weak one for sure. So maybe not the best solution to shove. Raise non-all in will look more strong. Not really capable of raising non-all in a bluff in this situation. I'd go for call today after thinking more deeply about the spot. Okay, cool. So pretty interesting hand, and explained the thoughts there. And so basically the hand went King Jack 5, you're on the button, pretty much 25 big blinds deep, around that. And playing against the big blind who calls, and you check behind on this flop. Well, he's checking assumingly with his entire range, and hero checks back. I see a lot of people do this. I think it's mainly a mistake. And then on the turn, we hit 2-pair, and we decide to jam, funnily enough. I actually noticed that this 9 brought a flush. I thought it brought a second flush draw, like another spade. Although, in the analysis, it shouldn't make the largest difference. So let's get into the analysis. So firstly, I got two. I'm gonna start using simple post flop now as my main solver, because I believe that it can do more things, especially on turns and rivers, in terms of you can like kind of lock a ladder and double lock and stuff as well, which is really interesting. But yeah, I got access to simple now through the hyperscroll server, so I'm going to be using that more often now. These are both the GTO solutions. Later I'm going to talk about some exploits. So let's firstly start talking about GTO, basically, and how GTO would be playing. So firstly, as we notice, I did put in correct pre-flop ranges and sizings, and for button versus big blind. And okay, so basically he should be checking pretty much his entire range to us, and that is that's going to be when in position should be betting. As we see, in position can be betting almost his entire range. I mean, there's a few combos of hands that might sometimes want to check. There's like the weakest king in the deck, like King 2 can sometimes check. This Ace-8 is going to be the Ace-8 of spades, but, you can just bet that too. Like, it won't make a big difference, and, like, other Ace-X of spades are going to be betting as well. So, small thing, Jack-6, again, one of the weakest jack, maybe. Like, the difference between betting and checking will be small, obviously. Just what happens to the rest of your range when you check. It's going to be so bad. 10s, 9s, and 8s are kind of the best hands to be checking, but even those are like, not so great. So overall, I'd say you can pretty much just bet your entire range. By the way, when I analyze hands in simple, one thing that I like to do is I like to round it just to 100%, because it means that a combo of hand is going to bet 100% of the time, depending on the suit. So for example, like 10-10 with a heart is going to bet 100% of the time here. 10-10 without a heart will check 100% of the time. If you didn't have it this way, like I can do this as well, and we see now it's going to end up being much more mixed. You're going to have like 50-50 and stuff, and you're going to have like, I don't know, 10% checks with a bunch of random stuff. In reality, when I analyze stuff in simple, I prefer to just make it even more simple by putting 100%, and that way it allows me to, instead of, let's say, use a randomizer, or instead of just trying to remember these weird frequencies, I can remember the exact hand combo. I find it much more practical in game, not being a robot and being a human with a very limited brain capacity. I think that's much smarter and realistic thing to do for us mortals. So yeah, I try to remember specific hands rather than specific frequencies, which can get even more complicated. than what this already is. Luckily on this flop, we can see bet 100% of our range, pretty much as we see. I mean, 96% here. If you normalize it to 100%, that will not make a big difference at all. And you'll notice that the button three-way is going to be able to do this on tons of flop, basically any disconnected flop. And when I say a disconnected flop, I mean any flop that doesn't have three connected cards. So in this situation, the king and jack are connected, so you can have a few straight draws between the king and the jack, but the 5 has nothing to do with the jack or the king, so like it's still disconnected. If the 5 were the 7 instead, then I believe GTO would start constructing much more of a checking range. But even then, you know, the button three-way GTO has about 80% c-bet, so it's really hard to reach that c-bet cap, and you can basically bet 100% of your range on a ton of flops. Also notice that the only sizing I chose here is like basically one big blind, or 25% of the pot. The reason is because I already did the calcs with different sizings. There's no need to go any other sizing. It's not going to use any other sizing than one big blind on this particular flop and most disconnected flops in general. So now we have to ask ourselves why should we be betting 100%? Because just because something is GTO, it obviously doesn't mean it's going to be the correct move against the population, or against a weak reg, or against a fish, or against a strong reg, whatever. So, you know, you should be playing differently against different player profiles, obviously. But in this particular case, I personally think we should c-bet our entire range pretty much anyways, regardless of who we play against. We'll talk about that later, but yeah, like, I mean, checking back with this particular hand isn't, like, the worst. I mean, it's not terrible, basically, you know? Like, the EV difference is extremely small. The difference between checking and betting is very small here, as we see. The EV difference between, for example, King-Queen, it's still small, but it's, like, it's bigger, you know? It's, like, still better to bet in general overall. And so why is GTO betting its entire range? It's betting its entire range because firstly, we've got a range advantage, as we know. The big blind does actually have more combos of kings than us, so king high boards, button versus big blind, actually are not too bad for the big blind, because the big blind is going to call all of his king 2 and better, basically, whereas we are not opening like worse than king 9 or king 8 off. So it's going to be very close, basically. But we still have a range advantage. We've still got all the better draws. We've got all the like ace queens that make nut straights, or like very strong flush draws. Ace X's hearts, ace X's spades are in there. Also, we have all the combos of pocket kings, pocket jacks, pocket 5s, which the big blind pretty much never has, right? Yeah, the big blind never has that. So we've got a very strong nuttiness advantage, basically. So we have a huge nuttiness advantage. We've got a slight range advantage. Our equity and EV advantage, as we see, our equity and our EV advantage is going to be here. We've got a pretty significant EV advantage. I mean, 3-1, basically. That's a very big equity and EV advantage, which means that, yeah, we should take advantage of this and bet our entire range. But that's not the only reason, because, I mean, that's like, you know, explaining the technical details of why GTO is betting, but a lot of people don't know how to exploit somebody who is going to be, you know, checking back some hands such as Jack X. And if you're not exploiting that, then there's nothing wrong with checking back Jack X, actually. Because if people don't know how to play against the check back, then, which a lot of people don't, then checking back can be perfectly good. But if you're playing against somebody good, or if you're playing against at least somebody who's studied the spot, like me, I am gonna take advantage of the fact that your check back range is very capped, and I know exactly what you're doing. At least in 90% or more of cases of people who check back. We're going to explain and go through how to exploit people who check back the Jack X in this review later on. Okay, so let's talk about Big Blind's reaction now to the c-bet. So because it is a king-high board, we actually can construct a decent raising range. It's going to raise here about 10% of the time, like 9.5. And the hands you want to raise for value would generally be King 9 plus, as we see. Pretty much every combo of King 9. As for two pairs, it's kind of like splitting between two pairs. Although in general it'd still raise, like King Jack is still mostly a raise. Jack 5 is always a raise, and like King 5 can be one of the combos that you could use to just slow play. Although the difference between these won't be massive, and like I wouldn't mind if you like raise King 5 instead of King Jack or whatever, basically. As for bluffs, for the check raise, it would usually go for some weak ace-x. So here, weak ace-x with the ace of spades, usually. So ace 4 and worse. Ace, yeah. Where's the raise button? So, as we see, it's always going to have the ace of hearts, sorry, not the ace of spades, with the backdoor flush draw, basically. It's going to be very good to raise this, as we're going to be able to represent a few more of those cards. And we can also raise some actual flush draws, some actual weak ace-x with a flush draw. So ace 4, ace 3, ace 2 with the hearts will be perfectly fine to be raising. Ace 6 as well in this situation will be fine to be raising. You could also consider maybe some like backdoor type of hands, such as, for example, 8-6 or 8-7 with the backdoor straight draw in addition to the flush draw, because these are, they've got more potential for you to be barreling if you hit your backdoors again. Backdoor straight, I mean. You don't want to like float random, like, 8-2 of spades or something. That's too weak of a backdoor, so, just let those go. Even if he's c-betting 100%, there's not much you can do against it with your like naked backdoors. You actually need backdoors with additional equity. So backdoor flush draw plus an ace would be fine to call with. Backdoor flush draw with like a gut shot, 10-9, something like that. But naked backdoor flush draws shouldn't be continued. You could also consider bluffing with like 10-9 with a spade, basically. With a spade or a heart, sorry. No, just with a heart, actually. Yeah, that makes sense. And for your sizings, I didn't change the sizing to only one. I included the split sizings between big and small. You don't need to do this, but basically GTO would raise big with like King, Queen, and Jack 5, because those are more vulnerable for value. And like ace-x of hearts also work well to raise big, since you can, like, these are the type of hands you don't mind just jamming on the turn after you check raise on like a ton of different turns. Pretty much. Let's not analyze too much what to do on the turn. It's pretty straightforward. If you got equity or if you got a strong hand, you keep barreling. If you don't turn, much equity, you can give up a bit more. Okay, so let's look a bit at the turn. Over here, we're going to look at the 9 of spades. So it completes the queen 10, brings a second flush draw. This is after you see bet the flop, right? So it's not the actual hand. But basically, out of position should be checking 100% of his range, and then in position should barrel about half the time, slightly less than 50% of the time. And the sizing, I didn't include an overbet size, but if there was an overbet size, it might actually use an overbet size, very likely to be kind of splitting between like 75% and 150% of the pot in this exact situation. But it's over here, since there's no overbet, it's going to be leaning towards a full pot size bet. And the reason for that is that there's, it's a pretty draw heavy board. We're going to get a lot of value with our kings. And so it wants to like basically bet full pot with a king or like a strong king or better, and then include some decent bluffs in there. And yeah, when we are looking at this particular turn, we need to realize that there's going to be a lot of rivers, which will make a naked king not the strongest hand anymore, which out of position has to be calling. So for value, in position is going to be barreling with, again, king 9. King 9 plus for value basically is very strong and standard. And the only like hand that it wouldn't be barreling that is stronger than king 9 would be pocket kings. That would be for balance purposes, and since pocket kings is blocking a lot of villains like calling range, so it can use these to bluff catch on the river. Although that's the only combo, like even like king 5, king 9, king jack, jack 5. Jack 5 and Jack 9, they are going to be barreling as well. So the weak King X, such as King 8 and worse, as well as Jack X, these are considered kind of like showdown value, and a lot of people would just keep barreling these, but as we see, GTO would never barrel these because it wants to be able to protect its river calling range as well. It's not going to protect its river calling range by checking back tons of strong hands like 2 pairs and sets, as we see. Rather, it would just protect its river calling range by checking back some of its weaker hands that don't really have value to barrel for value. And it can just get value by bluff catching on rivers. It can bluff catch, a ton of rivers with a naked king, like a weak king or something. So that's why weak kings and a lot of, well, basically everything weaker that has showdown value with a weak king can be bluffed. So when we look at bluffing hands, a lot of people in this spot, they think they have bluffing all wrong, actually. They elect to bluff with hands like 7-6 or 8-6, 8-7, these type of hands that have gut shots, right? They're like, oh, I got 7-6 of hearts, 7-6 of spades. I need to bluff. Oh, like, because I turned my gut shot. But actually, it's totally the other way around. The best hands to bluff would be like, the strong draws, ace, queen, ace 10. And a lot of people, they have ace, queen, and ace 10, and they're like, these hands have showdown value. Why would I go ahead and bluff it? But the truth is that, firstly, they don't have that much showdown value. Secondly, even if they do have showdown value, you can fold out a decent amount of hands that beat you. Like, you're going to fold out a decent portion of Jack X, 5X, 9X maybe, that beats you on the turn, and that's great. And you can also force some hands that do not beat you to call. So like, you know, a lot of like flush draws, especially if they have a gut shot or something, are going to be forced to check call, and then you can like end up checking these on the river. And also these draws dominate the draws of others. So for example, if a queen comes and you've got ace 10, you're going to dominate that, you know, you're going to dominate that 10-9, and stuff like that. So it's way better to barrel with your strong draws in this situation rather than the weak draws. Whereas weak draws are important to be barreling, to be checking, sorry, like 8-6, 7-6, because we have so few of these combos in our range. We only have suited hands, whereas big blind is going to have all the off-suited combos of these as well, right? So on a 6, 7, or 8 on the river, if it goes check, check, if we don't check these back, so let's just say we do check these back, right? And like if we bet these, what's going to happen is that I mean, if we're not checking these back, then we're going to be betting them, and because of that, our checking back range is even weaker on like a 6, 7, or 8, and so villain can basically put tons of pressure on us by like over betting on the river, or like betting huge on the river when a 6, 7, or 8 comes, which is obviously not something we want, and he can put us into really difficult spots. So that's one of the reasons why like it would much rather check these type of hands back, and they are much better to be checking back rather than the strong draws. Yeah, so some other combos to be bluffing would be your weak aces. These actually don't have much showdown value. You wanna barrel them, and against a check raise, you can actually, I don't know what you do against a check raise. It's pretty interesting. Let's say he jams. Yeah, you have to fold these. Not enough equity. But you can end up calling with ace queen and ace 10, which you are betting all the time. So let's quickly look at what happens if, like, let's just go here, right? And, sorry, where's the bet sizings? Why? What happened to the bet sizings here? All right, check, and, okay, the biggest sizing is 4.5. So I think I need to add a node here. And make it 6.75. Okay, and let's calculate this turn again quickly. I'll pause this video for a second. While we wait for this to calculate, we can also look at, for example, the 9 of hearts here. It's the same 9, it completes the straight, but here it also brings in the flush draw. So again, he's going to be checking his entire range. The difference is we're going to be barreling with a smaller sizing firstly, because right now we're betting a very merged range. Even like hands like king queen are not so strong anymore, as we see. So you're interested in checking back way more value to be able to bluff catch a lot more, because facing a check raise with a lot of hands would be absolutely terrible, obviously. And you're even checking back all two pairs, because like a flush is obviously a very realistic card in villain's range, and so you're not gonna barrel very much, and you're gonna end up polarizing your range much more often on the river. And so you're going to be barreling with a flush mainly. That's your main card, and since a flush doesn't need protection, you can use a smaller sizing, you can incentivize more calls. It's only betting half pot here mostly, and then you'd start actually splitting and polarizing on the river. You'd basically go all in on the river, mostly. What is going on? Oh, that's what's going on. Alright, so now we're back to this. Well, we were looking at the 9 of spades, but to explain what's going on a flushing card, I think this explains it pretty well, although we could also look like on a 4 of hearts is obviously much more of a blank than a 9 of hearts. So you can start barreling a bit more, but again, you're not going to pot it. It's going to be splitting between half pot and 3/4 pot. So you kind of understand how flushes work now, hopefully. Let's get back to the 9 of spades here, because that is pretty interesting. So I wanted to explain what happens when we start splitting our ranges. So firstly, let's use non-GTO here. So let's say that this player is gonna be barreling with these hands, right? And maybe he's gonna like check back more with like ace queen, ace 10, because that's what a lot of people are doing basically. So instead of barreling with those strong hands, he's going to go ahead and barrel with those strong hands. So his barreling frequencies overall are kind of similar. So now we have to calculate this again, and we're going to look at some rivers. But over here, if we look, what's going to happen is it's going to change, not really what our calling range should be, I think, but it should change what happens on the river when the board goes check, check on the turn. So we check, check, and the river comes, I don't know, let's say the 7 of diamonds. And I need to calculate the river. And if we look at the GTO solution here on the left, we see that out of position is going to be jamming a bit, but not too much. And he can't take too much advantage of the 7 because we have a lot of hands such as, 9. We should have a lot of hands such as 9, 7, 6, 8 still in our range, Jack 7 and all of that. Whereas over here, so we check, check, and over here we see what's going on? Yeah. So we check, check, and we're actually going to check a lot more, which is actually kind of unexpected. I didn't expect that. What's going on here? Are we going to go for check raise a lot more or something? Check raising 12%. Check raising about 12% as well. Interesting. Over here, maybe we should change it to like 4. So over here we calculated the river. Oh, I'm sorry. What I did is I made him check back his queen 10 as well. That's why the calcs look all messed up. So let me just redo this. So he has to be barreling queen 10. I think what I should do is I should edit this and make him barrel queen 10 all the time. So now he's barreling queen 10 because that's the nuts here. Yeah, so I need to do this. So let me just recalculate. Yeah, okay, so now that we corrected the strategy where both players are still barreling queen 10, so in position is always going to barrel the nuts here, which most people will be doing, and his bluffs will be consisting, instead of like the ace, queen, ace 10 type of hands, like this guy, like GTO would be doing, it's going to consist of the weak straight draws. So now what's going to happen on these low cards all of a sudden is, so for example, on a7, it's not actually going to change too much. The only difference is that, yeah, in position isn't going to have too many like 8-6, 8-10 type of hands. Did I? Yeah, I should have also included 8-10 in there, by the way, right? Yeah, let's go ahead and do that, because I think a lot of people would actually barrel 8-10. That's going to make the difference even more pronounced. What else? So the board is 8-10, like, and maybe 10-7, like these type of weaker draws. I think a lot of people would rather barrel them because they think that they don't have much showdown value. So now that we've got all of these, let's, like all of those cards are not connecting to the low range, and this is how a lot of people play. They think that they should check back ace queen, ace 10 on the turn. So let's quickly wait for this to recalculate. Okay, so back here we've got the guy who hasn't studied the spot barreling all of these low draws as well as 10-8, 10-7. And the reason why GTO would check these back is not only because these have more equity, but also to protect its river range. And also because if you get check raised when you're barreling these, it really sucks to have to fold them, which you would be doing. So we check, and now we're on the river, and I think, yeah, what we see now all of a sudden on a 7, which is kind of like it's only connecting with 8-10 and 6-8 here. As we see all of a sudden, the out of position player can start probing much more often. So here, out of position is checking 45%, here it's checking 55%, and it's never over betting. I mean, I didn't actually include like a 150% pot. That would be interesting to see. Maybe we could add like, you know, like 8 big blind bet, see what happens. By doing that, and we can calculate and calculate. And yeah, so here we see that villain's never gonna jam. Like, what's really amazing here is that because 8-10 and 6-8 are not in positions range ever, now all of a sudden Simple's response to this player who is not betting the 6-8, 8-10 ever, he's gonna jam. It's gonna be the same on, like, for example, a 6. As we see, we have to, looks like we have to calculate these again as well. At least rivers don't take long. But as we see, check 49, check 53, so it's checking a bit less. But again, over here, a lot of out of positions bets can actually be a jam, and it's going to even jam with hands as weak as like King X for simple value. Like King 8 is always going to be a jam because, like, look at, for example, like he's got to call King 6, and well, King 6 is a 2-player, but like King 7 has to call, and like Queen Jack has to call because like Ace 6 is a decent bluff catcher because he's so capped that he needs to call some of these weak hands, and these are basically the strongest hands that he has in his range. Like, yeah, sometimes he might luck out and hit a set of 6s or like a 2-pair, but that's going to be pretty rare. And otherwise, if you jam, firstly, you've got a lot of value, but you've also got a ton of fold equity, so it's great for both a bluff and a check. So that's like basically a pretty interesting exploit you can make on these 6, 7, and 8 cards if you're playing against someone who you think is playing that type of a strategy. And that would be why GTO is going to be checking back hands such as 6, 7, 7, 8, 8, 10 in positions shoes. It's so that in out of position isn't able to just overbet jam like a ton of its range. It's going to be the same, for example, on the 8. let's see how this changes everything. Again, the 8 is pretty good card for out position. And again, the frequencies won't change much, but the sizings can be basically much bigger. Although the 8 is less effective than the others. But yeah, hope you saw the point. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go back to GTO and let's make some comparisons. So on the left, I'm going to keep GTO. And on the right, I'm going to put the check backing medium hands. So in this situation, this is what a lot of people tend to do. So as we saw, GTO is going to be barreling pretty much 100% of the time. I mean, c-betting the flop 100% of the time. But however, a lot of people, they check back their jacks and maybe pocket queens, maybe some of their weaker kings, you know. They might check back like pocket 10s, 9s, and 8s all the time as well. So, you know, this is how a lot of regs are playing. And this is what actually happened in the hand, right? He was checking, Hero was checking Jack X here. Jack 9 to be exact. And we explained a few reasons why GTO wouldn't do that, but one of the biggest, but like people don't know how to exploit this, because like people see this and they're like, oh, how to exploit this? Well, firstly, we can look at how to react against the C. So the thing is, against the C-bet, the reaction isn't going to change terribly. I mean, if we look at these two, it's actually pretty similar in terms of raising frequencies. It's not so different. It's like 8% and about 10%. So we're actually raising less. One thing that we're doing though is that we're going to call more. So we're folding a bit less as well. Reason for that is that because over here he's a much more polarized, so there's less need to raise. Instead we can either probe on rivers to seal the pot, or however, the main thing is we're going to attack the check back range much more, which is kind of interesting. So over here we see that yeah, we're basically raising less for value. We can't raise hands like King 10 or King 8 anymore really for value. They're just not strong enough because button has so many more strong combos since we removed like a lot of the mediocre hands. So we're not really getting value from jacks anymore anyway. So you basically you can even like basically call almost 100% of the time, apart from like King Queen maybe, against people who do stuff like this. Another thing is that since his betting range is more polarized, it's got more air, so therefore you can call more backdoors. So whereas before we were folding hands such as a6 with 6 of hearts, we were folding this. Over here we're going to end up calling it. So more backdoors can be called, basically. Same with like Queen X of spades. These can be called more because they're stronger spades. They've got more. Like 10-7 as well. 10-7 of spades can also be called more, for example. But in terms of raising, both for value and bluff, it's going to go down, which is the first thing. But the big thing is to exploit on the turn when they check back. So let's go ahead and let's look at a 4, because the 4 is a pretty blank card. So this is going to bring some huge differences. So over here, firstly, I think I should add an overbet as well. So let's just add like an 8 big blind bet and do the same here. So we got, and let's calculate both of these. And let's wait for this to count. So actually I didn't need to include the 8BB. It wouldn't change anything because 6BB is already an overbet. I thought it was the size of the pot, but it's not, as we see. But here we can see the big difference when somebody starts to check back a lot of the jacks on the flop here. a lot of their jacks, queens, and they're not balancing it with having any very strong hands, we can start putting that range under massive amounts of pressure. This is the GTO solution. It really doesn't matter because, you know, we're betting basically 100%, so this really doesn't matter too much at all. I'm just, I don't know, just putting it there to look at. What we should be looking at is this, and we see a massive amount of overbetting and with a pretty high frequency. Basically, anytime you have, like it's on a blank four, basically, and pretty much anytime you've got the opportunity to probe here with any equity at all, you should pretty much go ahead and overbet. Like we can look at all the no-made hands. It's going to be bluffing pretty much even every combo draw, even hands like 5 with a flush draw are going to be bluffing a lot. Fours with a flush draw are going to be bluffing like all the time, funnily enough. Just because like they need to fold a decent amount of their hands. They need to fold pocket queens sometimes. They need to fold some of their jacks. They need to fold some of their, like all their pocket pairs. And that's really great. And also we're going to be able to barrel a ton on the river, obviously. And anytime you have any type of equity, any straight draw or anything like that, it's a great opportunity to just basically overbet. And a lot of people don't do this. A lot of people will just check back in fear that, oh, they have a jack, so I cannot, like, you know, like a lot of people know that when people are checking back a jack, or like checking back on this flop, they tend to have a jack or like a weak king or some type of showdown value. And a lot of people are like, I don't want to bluff into that because like, why would I bluff into that? But it's actually like, yeah, you shouldn't bluff into it if you're gonna bluff small, right? If you're gonna bet like, you know, 3 big blinds, like half pot and then half pot on the river, that's not gonna work very well. But if you start putting his entire stack at risk, if you start like over betting, and then you start like basically, let's say, jamming on a blank river, uh, like, you know, like jam, like don't pot it, don't like bet half pot or anything, just jam on the river. You start putting the entire stack under pressure. And like it would be pretty amazing if people actually call these. Like they should call every single king. They should call like a good portion of jacks even. And a lot of people are just going to fold everything. Like people are going to fold more than this a lot of times. So if you start putting them under immense amounts of pressure, that's how to exploit people who are checking back medium to weak ranges. Because a lot of people won't, they'll call against small bets, but once you start overbet and jamming, they're going to stop doing that. So this is basically how to exploit the people who are doing things like this. Even on a river such as, I don't know, an ace, you could say. It's like, because he's not checking back any aces, you can put immense amounts of pressure on that. Like basically we had a 2 of spades earlier. This was the answer. We're still bluffing pretty much everything, as we see, pretty much bluffing everything. I mean, sometimes you're checking some air hands, but if it's a heart, then you're almost not checking at all on the river. So, you know, it's basically like, all right, they capped their range, we can attack it by overbetting and jamming. And a lot of people are kind of scared to do that, but it's really effective. And I do this a ton. If I know that people are checking back on the flop with this range, which is what most people do, then this is how you'd exploit it. And it's very easy to exploit. And yeah, like if they're checking these hands back, they really need to balance their checking range, and people just don't do that. Like they should be balancing their checking range by, you know, like putting a jack into your checking range is not balancing it. It's exploiting yourself. Because you're not putting any air hands. Like, where are your air hands that you're checking? Are you checking ace X back sometimes? Are you because you need to check back some ace X? Are you going to check back some pure air hands? Are you going to check back, you know, some like, I don't know, some, I don't know, 6-4, like randomly, some like 10-7 randomly? Most people don't do that. Like, they say that they do sometimes, but in reality, they don't. Like, people say, oh yeah, sometimes I do this, but you know, if you bet it once, you usually always bet it. That's just how humans work. Also, with like if you want to bet these, you need to put some very strong hand combos in. For example, you should put in some two pairs sometimes in order to bluff catch. But the problem with checking two pairs is that you're going to be losing so much value now all of a sudden. So that's why it works way better against pretty much the entire population to just bet your entire range on the flop. Also, like a jack is a very good hand to just bet the flop, and then you can check behind on the turn, and it means you're going to be able to bluff catch on a lot of rivers. Yeah, some rivers are going to be bad, but like I think it's way easier to play to just bet your jacks, especially if you're multi-tabling. You know, like there's a reason why Monkey Boss can play 12 tables. It's because he follows, he knows GTO rather well, and even though he's an exploitative player, he basically, like, if there's not a difference between an exploitative play and a GTO play, like he's gonna follow the GTO play, and it's basically automatic. Like betting a jack, like, or betting the entire range should pretty much always be automatic for everyone here. We can quickly look at the 9. I mean, not too much changes. But, so over here, we're actually not gonna probe so much. And the reason for this is because on a 9, we can expect the button to be very much incentivized to delay with a lot of hands. And the truth is, I think, like, we can pretty much check our entire range, I think. But the truth is, over here, we have the button who's delaying, you know, about half the time. And I think a lot of people will delay even more. They'll delay with hands like pocket queens. They'll delay with more of their jacks, more of their kings. They're not going to check twice and protect their checking range. Instead, they're just going to delay with everything because, oh, look at the board. It's so scary. There's like a 10 or queen brings a straight. There's 2 flush draws. And so actually, because we expect a lot of delays, we can just go and check raise like a madman, pretty much. So that's what we're going to be doing when they delay with, let's say, half pot. Yeah, we go and check raise. Like, we're going to fold a lot, obviously, because we're checking a good amount of our range. Obviously, we're folding pretty much everything that is weaker than them. So we're going to fold even a lot of jacks. We're calling every king. However, we're going to be check raising for value very light. Like, again, we're going to check raise king 9. We're going to check raise a few bluffs, like 10-9 works very well, and we're going to check raise some nice, interesting bluff combos, such as the weak flush draws. So you're gonna basically create a massive check raising range, whereas over here we see it's like a 20% check raise versus a 12% check raise percentage. So yeah, it's basically you're going to put a lot of pressure on them, but the difference is by check raising. If you want to just bet and barrel instead, I don't mind that. It's not going to be huge, but on a blank, very important to bet and barrel. But yeah, the idea is if they start checking back a mediocre capped range, then you exploit that by putting tons of pressure on them on Future Street. Okay, so now that we looked at that, let us ask ourselves what happens if villain is barreling incorrectly. So not necessarily wrong, you know, but... So we got the GTO solution on the left, and on the right we have an exploit version. So this time we have the people, both of them are betting fine on the flop, which is good for once. It's like, this is the least you should do. Bet your entire range on the flop. Now let's say we're on the turn, and over here I'm gonna have people barreling differently on the turn. So as we see here, I locked the turn. So again, 100% check from the big blind after check calling the flop. And okay, so what's changing? I mean, nothing's changing. This dark green means pink here. It's the only difference. You can change the colors by doing this. Doesn't matter. Okay, let's do this to make it look more family friendly. So over here, I changed the barreling ranges. I already kind of went over this earlier, but basically, as we see, I made this guy barrel more hands, like, again, 6, 7, 8, 6, 9, 6. And only half the time. So he's actually got less bluffs overall, because he's not bluffing ace queen, stuff like that. 1 second though, I need to. God, I again didn't include queen 10. He needs to be betting queen 10, like for sure. And yeah. And also he should be checking. Here he's checking 8-10. I think I'm gonna include that a bit more in his betting range. So let's just, include 10-8, and let's calculate this now. And it's gonna be very similar to what we saw earlier, but I already showed you this. But let's wait for this to calculate. Okay, so here we are with these ranges again. And the first thing is, let's look at the differences in response against the barrel. So he's barreling much less frequently here, which is how a lot of people play. A lot of people are not barreling very much on these turns. And if they barrel, they would much rather barrel with hands such as, 8, 8-6, 8-7, maybe 10-8 a bit. And yeah. So the response, again, it's not going to be too different. One of the main differences is that you can call a bit more with these types of hands, like ace-x, like ace-8 and ace-7, for example. Because since they're not barreling with as many aces, it means that this ace is going to be an out now all of a sudden. As we see here, we made him stop barreling. A lot of people would even stop barreling these weak aces, right? So if they're not barreling these, then you can call even more with them. Apart from that, nothing really changes too much. I think absolute weight would be better. Just wait for this to update so we can make better comparisons. But again, the main difference would be coming on the river. So, if it goes check check, and the river comes like a 6, check check. So this is what we went over earlier. You can start betting with much larger sizings. Although over here it isn't showing as much because we didn't include 10-8 earlier in the other checking range. But yeah, like these type of hands, like a 7-6, are definitely more in our range, and so we can definitely start to bet much more, especially with larger sizings, especially if we assume that they're going to be checking more with, barreling more with 10-8, which we did earlier, but this time we see we're not doing that. So over here, the difference won't actually be so huge. It's going to be very, very, very similar, although you are still going to use a larger sizing more than a smaller sizing. You're not going to use too much block betting, and you can value bet every king even more. Okay, so now let's look at what happens if people start protection betting on the turn, because this is another league that a lot of people have, especially fish, right? So let's say that someone is, they c-bet the flop, and then we check to them on the turn, and then so we check to them on the turn, and then instead of, having a very polarized betting range, like betting barreling king 9 plus, they decide that they're going to go ahead and bet all of every king, like including king 3, king 8. They're going to bet like ace jack, pocket queens, and they're going to use like a smaller sizing. A lot of weak regs have something like this. So in this situation, because they're betting small, so one of the big things we would do is against a small bet, we would go ahead and raise a ton. Whereas over here, it's basically never betting small. So like there's not going to be many raises. But here we see there's like 40 something percent of raises. Here there's only 6. So over here on the turn, we're going to turn our range into a very much like raise or fold situation, because our kings basically have a ton of equity against his small barreling range. So every king now becomes a value raise. So you can just go ahead and raise small. Although if you'd rather just jam, that's going to be better than calling. You can also jam with hands such as, king, like flush draws plus a pair. A lot of combo draws work very well as those type of jams. And it's going to work very well if people are kind of like protection betting on the turn. It's not going to work very well if people are like betting small with like king queen or something, but in general people don't do that. And yeah, if we look at the large bet over here, so this guy's going to be betting large now. Sorry, it should be 6, should be this sizing. This is the standard sizing that they should use. So this is the pot size bet, right? And if they bet, big blind's reaction is going to be that now that they're betting large, we can start folding more of our kings, actually. So a lot of people think that we should never be folding a king on the turn to a second barrel, but as we see, if they start splitting their sizings on the turn and they start polarizing really hard, we can actually start to fold a lot of our kings, because their barreling range becomes so much more polarized and so much stronger. So in terms of raising and everything, that doesn't change too much. But the barreling range became much more polarized, and like king 7, king 8 even is really close. It's not going to beat king 9 plus. And instead of exploiting the large sizing, if you know someone's splitting their sizings, you can fold more to the large sizing. Although I wouldn't even say that's the biggest difference. I think maybe the biggest difference is what's going to happen when they go ahead and check back. Because over here, they're not checking back any bluff catches for rivers. And a lot of people, they look at this board, and they think, oh my god, I need to barrel here and protect my jack or protect my pocket queens, protect my weak king, because on the river, how am I ever going to be able to call if they probe? It's going to put me in a tough spot. Well, yeah, it's going to put you in a tough spot, but you're actually going to be in an even tougher spot if you don't protect your range. Like if you don't have some kings to call on the river with, I mean, you're kind of screwed basically. So let's just look at what happens on a deuce here. So on a deuce now, if we compare these, over here, big blind will be probing about half the time, and over here, big blind will probe about 75% of the time. So as we see, it's going to probe much, much more, and it can basically even pot a jack for full value because since in position decided to barrel with a smaller sizing with all of its jacks and all of its like weak kings and pocket queens and stuff, we can exploit that by betting pot for value much more. And since we're potting for value much more with even jacks, which over here we can never do, it means we can also bluff much more. So you can basically almost never check unless you have like a 5 or like maybe a 9 or something, which count more as showdown value. Okay, so that's how to exploit people who bet small with mediocre hands on the turn, which I don't think is like terrible, but I mean, you know, if this happens on the river, that's not good for your range. And like I even see fish like pot on the river with a jack. I'm not sure if they know what they're doing or not, but you know, like I was the type of person who used to like bet small against fish with jacks a lot of the time on the turn, just because for the exact reasons. But then once I realized that a lot of fish are still going to pot the river with a jack, which a lot of regs actually don't do, I started to dislike it a bit. But anyways. Okay, I think that's basically going to be about it, I guess. So I could have also done something about like how to play against the calling station, but that was taking a lot of time. So I'm gonna end it here, and yeah, I thought this was a pretty interesting board, and hope you found it useful. But like I actually realized that we didn't talk about what to do against the turn after you check back. Okay, so firstly, because like that is like kind of irrelevant, but whatever. Let's just quickly look at it. So firstly, you're checking back. So you're checking back here. The 9 comes, which shouldn't really come too often. And anyways, the sizing he used was about pot, which isn't a bad size. Like pot is a fine size, although he shouldn't use it too much. Now the thing is, you need to, like, firstly, he shouldn't be betting too often. Like, a lot of people are just going to have a king, and they're just going to bet because they have a king. Like, yeah, I got a king, I want to, you know, charge those jacks. Like, maybe he's going to call me with jack 10, queen jack, whatever, pocket queens. So it's actually not terrible to be betting here in his shoes, although, like, it's still going to be, like, even a lot of hands, like flushes, 2 pairs, are going to be check raising, and then top pairs in his shoes against this capped range is actually going to be one of the better hands to just check behind, to just check to villain, because if he checks, then, you know, so he checks, and then you will presumably bet with a lot of your range, and that's going to allow him to check raise a lot more with some of his strong combos, such as those flushes, straights, and 2 pairs, and it's going to allow him to also check call with a weak king, for example, because a king might actually lose to a flush sometimes, like if you did check a flush back ever. But that didn't happen. He decided to bet, and so he's betting, and like basically you shouldn't really have a raising range. And the reason for this is because you need to realize that he's got all the combos of queen 10 in his range. He's also got every 2 pair in his range. He's got all this like straights, and you know, his betting range is actually pretty strong. And by raising, what you do is you basically allow him to play pretty perfectly. Like if he has a straight or a flush, or like a two pair, he calls, and it's easy. And if he has a one pair hand, he folds, and that's exactly what you don't want. You want to let people make mistakes. So we can look over here, and like basically he can fold everything that's worse than top pair. And even top pair is going to be very close. I mean, again, like there's zero raising range, obviously, but if you put in a raising range for you where you only raise like Jack 9 or something, yeah, it doesn't make too much sense. But basically the raise doesn't make much sense, especially since, again, you're in position, and it's actually not bad. Like, firstly, you don't have the strongest two pair. So your two pair is already losing to a lot of his bets. Your two pair is Jack 9. It's already losing to King 9 and King Jack. It's not only losing to those two, it's also losing to straights and flushes. So it's losing to a lot of combos of hands. So your Jack 9 is actually not strong. It's a very middling hand, and so you want to treat it like a middling hand. It's not like, you know, King Jack. It's not like, maybe, I don't know, King Queen with the Queen of Hearts or King of Hearts or something, or Ace King with like Ace of Hearts, I don't know. Like, those are much more vulnerable hands, which might consider raising, but Jack 9 is actually like, it's pretty much the same strength as Ace King against his range, if you think about it. And it's very middling, and it's got an easy decision on rivers. Like, also you have to consider that on the river, if a 10 or a queen comes, he's not going to barrel, like, very often, because that's like a queen and 10 are certainly in your range. A fourth heart is certainly in your range. He's very often going to be shutting down, right, if he has if a queen or 10 or a heart comes on the river. So while you're worried about that card, those cards, so is he. And the fact that you're in position gives you a much bigger advantage than him. Maybe we could go back here and we could see what happens. I mean, this, again, like, you know, not really checking too much, but let's just see what happens. So let's say that this guy's going to bet. And again, it's never going to jam. But the hands that are jamming, let's do this so we can actually see the cards a bit. But the hands that are jamming is never going to be Jack 9, as we see. The hands that are jamming are going to be much stronger hands and some bluffs. Okay, okay. No, wait. Let's just assume that we know the ranges, right? So as we see, you've got your entire range here, and the way you play is you'd still call all your Jack 9, even King 9. You might consider jamming King Jack, because King Jack is a strong hand. You're actually getting value from worse two pairs. Pocket Jacks, Pocket 9s, Pocket 5s, Pocket Kings maybe. Pocket Kings is kind of on the stronger end. But all these like more vulnerable hands that are very strong. So King Queen, as I said. Queen 10, especially if it, like Queen 10 is great because you're not blocking his pairs. And then, you know, you're going to have a few bluffs in there, like Ace Queen. Basically Ace Queen, and that's about it. Like Ace King can go for value with the King of Hearts, as we see. But yeah, as we said, like Jack 9 is actually too weak to raise for value against his betting range. So this is how I would play against his probing, assuming I did check back, which I would never do. But kind of understand the way you should go about raising as well here. Okay, I think that's going to be it. Pretty much went through all the spots, and we went through the flop and quite a lot of turn and river spots as well. So I think this is pretty interesting. So thanks for posting the hand, and I hope that you and everyone else in the group found this useful. I hope everyone else posts some hands in here, which would be nice. And you also reply to people who post hands. And as you see, this can, like, these hands can be good for people to start working with solvers with this and figure some spots out as well.